So, good afternoon to all of you joining us this afternoon for this webinar. We have a little bit of a delay because one of our panelists had some problems to connect ourselves, but we are now trying to make it work. A few words of introduction from my side. I'm Jean-Louis Brouwer, and I'm the director of the European Affairs program of the Egmont Institute. When presenting the Commission's first strategic foresight report in early September, Vice President Šefčovič stressed that the pandemic has not only thrown a sharp light on our vulnerabilities, but also presented opportunities that the EU cannot afford to miss. The pandemic has also reaffirmed the need to make our policies evidence-based and future-proof. But the Vice President also stated that we cannot expect the future to become less disruptive. And by the way, this is well illustrated by a paper recently released by the European Parliamentary Research Service, which shows that how the megatrends that were identified by the 2019 ESPAS Global Trends Report risk being invalidated by the coronavirus pandemic. Building upon the achievement of the ESPAS network, as well as on a major risk mapping and capabilities and gap mapping exercise released by the EPRS during the summer, the publication of the Commission's first strategic foresight report was indeed seen as a milestone in moving EU's foresight capacity to a new phase. Taking place at the eve of the annual ESPAS conference, this webinar will provide an opportunity to better understand how and under which conditions foresight can help better identifying emerging trends to inform policymaking processes and steer strategic choices. A few housekeeping remarks before I turn to our distinguished panelists of today. This is a public event. It will therefore be recorded. You may ask questions by using the Q&R box. I will be supported during this webinar by my colleague Marcel Murail, who in the second phase of the webinar will synthesize the main questions that we have received. Please make sure that the questions are short and to the point, and don't hesitate to ask them and to put them in the Q&R box as early as possible. As we have limited time, we intend indeed to keep this webinar within the 60 minutes limit. Mr. DEBIE, let me turn to you as our first panelist. You are the director of the Library and Knowledge Services of the European Parliament. You coordinated the gap mapping exercise I was earlier referring to, and you are also a member of the steering group of ESPAS, which means that you are a very busy person at the eve of the conference, which starts tomorrow. All the more thank for you to be with us this afternoon. ESPAS was established almost 10 years ago to promote longer-term thinking in the EU policy process and encourage the Union's institutions to cooperate more closely in the field of foresight. As indeed the current pandemic has further exposed the need for stress testing and contingency planning, how could policy planners improve their capacity to develop future-proof strategies? Mr. DEBIE, the floor is yours. I understand that you are going to illustrate your presentation by a PowerPoint, and I will ask my colleagues to make sure that we have all of us access to this PowerPoint. Here it is. Mr. DEBIE, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be speaking in Egmont among so many friends and colleagues also, many of them having contributed one way or another to the ESPAS process. So before the large ESPAS conference tomorrow, where we attend 800 participants, it's good to be among friends and in the family. To answer your question, I would start just basically by a housekeeping issue. It's not possible for the Union to be resilient, future-proof, if member states, and in some cases even regions, are not doing the homework at home. What we have witnessed with this crisis, as we had witnessed in the past, both with the financial crisis and with the migration crisis, is that problem in one of the member states can easily become problems for the rest of us. And so if we want future-proof policy making, the first start, the first building block is at home. And this is giving a new role to policy planners in the member states with the different national actors to assess if their current capacity are fit for purpose, fit for crisis, but also to assess themselves if the arrangement they have for cooperation with others in the framework of the Union or in other framework are workable in phase of crisis. And this is, I think, what the three crises in a row have told us. We should start foresight, policy making, or a kind of foresight useful for policy making by better articulating with the national level. ESPAS, as you know, and this is my PowerPoint presentation very briefly here, was born, as you know, almost at the same time as the stress testing of the ECB that has become a common practice. But at the time when the ECB took the direction of dealing more and more with midterm or long-term issues through stress testing, especially to assess the risk in the private sector, the ESPAS process, bringing together the different institutions, took a slightly different direction that was to explore more or less horizon scanning and assess what was potentially leading in global trends up to 2030. Those are the two tables in blue. I will not comment. People can find them back in the ESPAS report. With the current crisis and under the leadership of Vice President Šefčovič, and also with a push inside of the European Parliament by our own president, we started to explore another direction. This other direction was first to do what Angela Wilkinson was calling in the past a kind of normative future exercise with backcasting. Basically, if we want in 2030 to become an autonomous or a sovereign entity in the world together, what do we need to do now in a phased manner, in a structured manner? But with the COVID crisis, we went one step further, and you mentioned it, we accepted a kind of deconstruction of a large model to reassess the different risks the Union is facing in the next 2 decades for resilience, with a very simple matrix, basically looking at what are the risks more likely with the largest potential in the next 15, 20 years, not only now, and what are the risks that have the largest impact. We could have a good guess that if we don't think and if we don't address risks with a large impact and with a large likelihood, the delivery of the European Union may be problematic. So we concentrated a little bit on the right-hand corner on the top, those risks that are the most likely in the next 2 decades and that are also with the largest impact. And here, without entering the details, you see that the first most prominent risk are social risks very clearly, followed by more structural economic risk, leading back to significant political risk and risk for the consistency and the cohesion of the Union itself. How was that exercise carried out? It was carried out as a dialogue where more than 200 policy analysts, researchers, people working in the committee, in the parliament. This is, in fact, a picture of the assessment made by colleagues close to policy making. What we derive from it is the kind of following roadmap. This is the last one. We discovered that the Union has capacity or capabilities that are not so short in front of certain risks, basically because they have been built in previous crises, especially in the financial sector and the economic monetary union. But we are also in domain where, for different reasons, many of them very good, having to do with competencies between member states and the treaty base, we have no financial capacity available at the Union and no strong regulatory or legal capacity available either. And this is, and you were asking me when we were preparing, this may be food for thought for any conference on the future of Europe. If we want such an exercise to be useful, without having maybe to go as far as an intergovernmental conference, very likely those questions in the red box and how we go there would have to be addressed. So I leave it here for colleagues to come with questions. And I couldn't do that without thanking all the people of the different institutions having contributed to this early exercise that is in itself a kind of building block for the more elaborate resilience report put forward by the Vice President Šefčovič and his team. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. DEBIE. I mean, I think that your first message concerning the building blocks and the member states has been heard loud and clear by Peter van Gemselker, and that he will want to elaborate further on that during his intervention. You also, of course, I mean, referred to the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is a fascinating animal for all think tankers of this planet and of this city in particular. And make sure you can be sure that someone, and if she's not someone from the audience, at least myself, will come back on that later during our conversation. Let me now turn to Nicole Dewald. Nicole Dewald is a member of the cabinet of the President Ursula von der Leyen, where she is in charge of foresight and education matters. Throughout her career in the Commission services, Nicole has been involved in different capacities in foresight and planning activities. Foresight studies are supposed to support decision-making by public authorities. However, experience suggests that their uptake and use is seldom simple, as the outputs of these studies may not be aligned with the needs and realities of policymaking. Nicole, you are part of the policymaking and the decision-making process of the Commission. What are the best ways to ensure that foresight studies are relevant for policymakers? And conversely, what are the best ways to improve the capacity of policymakers to use foresight? Nicole, thanks for joining us this afternoon. The floor is yours. You have to unmute yourself. Yes.
Right. So thank you very much, and hello to everybody. I'm also pleased to be given this opportunity to share some thought before the conference tomorrow. So indeed, strategic foresight is now in the center of what I don't know what it does there. Yeah, at the center of the at the core of the political agenda. You know that the President has mandated Vice President Šefčovič in his mission letter to embed foresight in the policy making. I think this is the first time. There has been foresight in the Commission. I was part of the FAST team under Ricardo Pretela leadership. I was also a member of the Forward Study Unit in the last time. So there has been foresight in the Commission. But it is the first time that there is a commitment of the political level at the Commission to embed foresight and to link it also to better regulation and our normal policy making. So Let's first admit that strategic foresight, which is the foresight as practiced by an institution, is not quite the same thing as classical foresight. The classical foresight that is undertook by foresighters and think tank is highly needed, but is available, and I don't think institutions should compete with that type of foresight, but indeed develop the foresight that will be useful for their policy making. Now is really the moment where foresight needs to sort of articulate itself with policymaking in a new way. I think we really need a step change in the interaction between foresight and policymaking as we have known it in the past. Why so? Because the political agenda for the moment is transition-led, and this was even before the pandemic came about. But as you know, the political guidelines of the President von der Leyen is driven by the twin transition, the green transition, climate neutrality in 2050, and the digital transition, and all that powered by an economy that works for people. So binding with that the social dimension. And this transition-led political agenda is something new. It is true that in the past college, we had the sense of I don't say that we discovered the issue of climate. Seeds have been planted by previous commission, but it is only now that they are at the core of the political agenda. And now now with the pandemic and the turbulent geopolitical context, I think that the dynamic dimension of policymaking is highest than it ever been before. And this dynamism and the change combines what the change we want policymakers to bring and the change we have to face. So there is a wanted dimension of change and a coping dimension of change, some change we have to cope with. And at the core of this dynamism and the importance of the dynamic dimension comes the resilience concept. And this is why we have focused the first foresight report of the Commission on resilience, to mark the fact that resilience is now the new compass for policymaking because of this challenge brought about by the dynamic dimension. And so I will not, and with that, I think we have also to honor the fact that despite a lot of people fearing that because of the pandemic and the crisis that came about, we would go back to our old habit, I think it is very clear that the strategy of the Union is a bounce forward strategy, and bouncing forward is really what Resilient Crowd is calling for, and there we are. So that's a very good basis, I think, to make the best use of foresight in policymaking in this challenging time. But for this to happen, I'd like to share with you some puzzles or questioning about what I have observed in the past about the relationship between policymaker and foresighter, to see if you are on board or not with what I feel quite puzzling and what I think we have a shared responsibility on both sides of the dialogue, policymakers on the one hand and foresighters on the other hand, to move from the sort of template or framing of our conversation to move to another type of conversation. Because in policymaking for foresight, there is sometimes, indeed politeness, some interest for what foresighters say, but also the feeling that it's never exactly what they are asking for, what they need at that very moment. This feeling that, yes, of course, it's interesting, but they don't quite know what to do with it. So that's a sort of a feeling of inadequacy, I would say, with what comes out of foresight for policymakers. And also the fact that they are saturated under a workload that they just cannot afford making the good use of this outcome of foresight work. On the foresight side, I feel there is recognition and acknowledgement of the attention they receive from policymakers when they do. But there is also with that a big frustration somehow, because they feel that if only they were listened to more, the world would be a better place. And they feel that if they were sort of at the place of the policymaker, that they could do better than what they do now. So I think, and this to some extent materialized in the paradox of Al Gore's situation, who became part of the foresight community exactly after he stepped down from power. And I think we need to remember that. Why is it that when he was in power, it wasn't so clear maybe what needed to be done, and it became clearer after? And the last question about this policy framework and foresight relation is as a woman, allow me to say that we are well placed to feel that some people, when they see what's coming about, it's never the good thing. So to be right too early is to be wrong in some circumstances. And this gender dimension that maybe you are stuck between either being a Cassandra when you're a woman announcing something, or it's a sort of bisounours type of thing if you don't announce necessarily the doom or catastrophist perspective. So this Cassandra or bisounours syndrome and problem. So all in all, I feel that there is something in the nature of politics that will always escape foresight. And this is not because we are not doing it good enough. It is because there are really two different types of worlds and of action, activity. Something about having the sense of the present, and because the modern era where we are now stepping out to some extent, but has been built on a devalorization of the present in the profit of the future. And to some extent, this systematic devalorization of the present is really a problem that we need to step out, and I plea for reclaiming the present. So when we, for example, I accept that short-termism is something wrong, that means that we accept that the short term is emptied of meaning. We should not accept that. We have to do with present. Politics has to be anchored into the present time. So it is very important to keep in this relationship between policymaking and foresight the strength and power of the present for itself, and not dream of a present that would be just slave of the future. Because the future is important and we need this perspective, but it cannot be at the expense of staying anchored in the short term. So I'm just calling for this rich and constructive combination between short term and long term, where each perspective is taken for what it brings. We need the perspective, we need to see what's coming about, but we also need to stay anchored and be aware of where we are. So that new combination between short-term and long-term is a challenge for both foresighters and policymakers, I would say. So indeed, it is very, and also that because policymaking has goals which are transitional. So we need to know how we can reach climate neutrality. Which itself is a perspective. We are not at the moment where we need foresight to tell us we need to reach climate neutrality. This is now something that is taken for, not for granted, but it's taken for commitment. And now we need to know how we do it. And for that, indeed, we need to imagine scenarios, we need foresight to widen the range of possibilities of getting there, to give us a sense of possibility, not the sense of what is to be avoided, but the sense of how we can make it. So, and I would also just end up on insisting on the importance maybe for foresight to consider also the power of changing the way we look at things, even at the present time. If we change the way we look at things, we change what can come out of the present. So the change is not only in the future, as if the present was fixed. Change can occur if we make good use of this ability to look at reality from different perspectives and favor the perspectives that will help us getting where we want to go. So for me, the challenge of foresight being useful for policymaking is revisit and improve the link between short-term and long-term. And I like very much what Franck said, the link between national dimension and EU dimension and the global dimension, is thinking of relations really beyond dichotomy and Manichaean opposition to make sense of what we do. And for that, foresight is crucial. So
Thank you very much. Thank you to Nicole Dewald, for this very thought-provoking contribution. You referred to questions and puzzlements. I think that these questions and puzzlements are also addressed to our two other speakers, who are Foresighters, and we might come back on them in the second phase of this webinar, because they might wish to comment and respond to your questions. Let me now turn to our third panelist, Peter van Gemselker. You are the Director for Strategy and Communication of the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But you are not completely alien, to put it mildly, to the EU, as you have been a member of the cabinet of Mr. Šefčovič in the previous team, in the Juncker team, as well as the deputy head of cabinet of President Van Rompuy. You also authored a recently published book about Europe Reinvented, how COVID-19 is reinventing the European Union. When presenting its first strategic foresight report, the Commission announced a series of initiatives aiming at embedding strategic foresight into policy making, and Nicole Dewald just referred to it. This would be achieved, amongst others, by supporting the development of foresight capacities in EU and member states, or launching an EU-wide foresight network, precisely at the occasion of the ESPAS conference, which will start tomorrow. How do you assess these initiatives, Peter? Will they indeed contribute to ensure coherence in the future policy debates by providing a shared framework of policy proposals? And initiating the debate in the second part of our webinar, I might also ask you to react as national planners to what you've heard from colleagues expressing views at EU level. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. Participating in a conference organized by the Egmont Institute, for me it's like a home game, basically. And I'm actually in a very comfortable position because I have the luxury to comment on two excellent presentations. I will focus a bit more indeed on how this is perceived from a member state perspective. But before that, I would like to go back to your introduction on the link between foresight and COVID-19, which is a bit the general framework in which this discussion takes place. I think there might be many reasons, and there are many reasons why in the first months of this COVID-19 pandemic, and I stress in the very first months, the reaction of the European Union was a bit slow. But this had definitely nothing to do with a lack of information or a lack of foresight, because when I was doing the research for my book, I was really surprised, I was really struck by the fact how many articles, how many studies, how much research was actually available, warning explicitly for what we are now in the midst of, a major corona pandemic. In September of last year, September last year, now we know that this is exactly the period where the first infections took place in Italy. At that very moment, there was a very interesting article in Foreign Affairs with a title basically saying the world knows that an apocalyptic pandemic is coming, and the subtitle, but nobody's interested in doing anything about it. And this was not an article on a study that was ordered or written by one obscure doomsday gang or something like that. No, this was a study ordered by the Secretary General of the United Nations. So basically the information was there. And that's why one of the conclusions that I draw, one of the preliminary lessons learned that I draw in my book, is that yes, we have to strengthen the foresight capacity. Definitely at the level of the member states, and I agree with the first speaker on that one. But we also have to strengthen the link between foresight on the one hand and decision-making on the other hand. Policy planning and policy making, decision-taking should go hand in hand. And for me, it's clear that the European Union, and in that respect, is really leading the way, showing which way we should go. The ESPAS initiative has already been presented. It's a great initiative, not only the last study, but also the 2019 study on the Global Trends 2030. Nicole mentioned the fact that this commission has actually created the function of vice president in charge of foresight. I don't know any member state, I don't know any country who has a minister for foresight, for example. We have ministers for agriculture, for justice, for interior affairs, but there is no such thing as a minister, to my knowledge, for foresight. Of course, in many foreign ministries, like in the Belgian one, or in the prime minister's offices, there are foresight teams. But I think Europe is really showing how important this topic is, also with the first foresight report. And the very important network, I think, that already exists of policy planners of the External Action Service, which is a very useful frame to exchange amongst member states foresight information. And I'm really looking forward to the initiative that will be launched tomorrow. So for a member state, everything that is happening on the European level is very important, I think, for two reasons. For information and for what I would call inspiration or motivation. Of course, it's crucial for capacity, for information, because foresight, in my experience, it's a very complex business. I mean, it's not something that you base on assumptions, on gut feelings. You base foresight on modeling, on analyzing different scenarios. When I talk about foresight, I always compare foresight with the triple jump in athletics. You have like 3 stages. The first stage, it's very closely monitoring, analyzing the megatrends. This is exactly what the Joint Research Center in the Commission is doing, looking at 14 megatrends, analyzing it. When I first ran into the GRC, I asked somebody like, what is it actually, the GRC? And he explained to me that this is basically the highest concentration of PhDs per square meter in Europe. So as a member state, why not rely on that expertise? Why not use this expertise instead of reinventing the wheel? So this is the first step, I think, the megatrends, where we benefit from the analysis that are being made at the European level. The second step, so to say, is basically making sure that whenever you take a short-term decision, and as policymakers you make many short-term decisions, but also as a CEO of a company you make short-term decisions, try to make sure that those decisions do not jeopardize, do not endanger the longer term. And that's also why you need, the reason why you need foresight. A good example is the whole discussion on stranded assets. If you know the low carbon trajectory, if you know where you have to be in 2030, 2050, with climate neutrality that was mentioned, then of course you also know where in the short term you better not invest your money. So that's the second step. And the third step is really the jump, the big jump. It's not only about avoiding a negative long-term lock-in in short-term decision-making, but also, and this I find very important, using foresight to seize all opportunities to also shape the future. Because foresight basically is not about predicting the future, but it's about shaping the future. I was very pleased by the speech, the State of the Union speech given by President Ursula von der Leyen, that basically said, the main message I took away from that speech is, we as a European Union are taking decisions not because others force us to take decisions. We are not taking decisions because the context, the circumstances force us to take decisions, but because we want to take our destiny in our own hands. And that's why you need foresight. If you know that 85% of the economic growth in the future will take place outside of Europe, you need a very ambitious trade policy. It's only one example. So all these analysis, all these data, all this information, I think is critical to build into and to feed into the foresight capacity of member states, especially smaller member states. But I think it's also a very important source of inspiration, because I think if we are honest, and I think Nicole hinted at it, foresight is not always an easy sell. We very often are stuck in our being very busy. We are stuck in short-termism, and it is an important element. I agree with Nicole on that. It's a very important element. But sometimes we are stuck in our short-term thinking, and we don't pay sufficient attention to the longer term. And that's, I think, why what we have to do a bit more, perhaps, is awareness raising. This is the reason why 2 months ago in September, within the Belgian Foreign Ministry, we created that directorate for strategy and communication, because we don't only want to communicate within a strategic framework, we also want to communicate better and more about that foresight, about those long-term trends, about the mega trends. Not because we think it's important, but also to create support for our policies. If we can explain what the long-term impact will be, what the long-term effects will be of the loss of biodiversity, for example, we have a much bigger chance to have an ambitious biodiversity policy. So that's why we make the link between strategy or foresight and communication. It basically goes back to what John Locke already said about foresight 150, 160 years ago. Foresight is all about understanding and explaining the sequencing of events. If you have a loss of biodiversity, it basically means as a result that you might have or you will have a pandemic. And this brings me back to COVID-19. I think the agenda that in the context of COVID-19, the foresight agenda that the Commission and the Parliament have put on the table is very relevant for us as member states. The focus on the twin transitions, which President Macron yesterday in that very long interview in Grand Continent called twin transitions with an anthropological impact, and I think he's right. So the focus on those twin transitions, the focus on the future of skills and jobs, and on the strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty, I think this is the right agenda that we need to tackle right now. And a good example, I think, is the communication that the Commission put on the table only two months ago in September on critical raw materials. It's something we are studying very, very carefully, because on the one hand, you make an analysis of the current situation, how vulnerable our supply chains are, and even more so in the COVID-19 times, but also looking into the future. One of the scenarios, it's a high demand scenario, but one of the scenarios that is very useful, if you reflect on it, is that by 2030, our demand for lithium will increase 18 times. And by 2050, our demand for lithium will increase 60 times. It's only one example, but it shows the direction in which we are going. And therefore, it also shows the decision we have to take right now. This kind of information, and again, if this kind of information circulates in all those networks of member states, of the institutions, I think it's a win-win situation. So I agree with the first speaker who basically said, like, member states also have to do their part of the job. Building up foresight capacity is important, but also let's learn from each other and let's use the information that is out there and implement them in our decision making. And I was very pleased by the first comment of Nicole, the distinction between strategic foresight on the one hand and traditional foresight. That's key, I think. That will be the main challenge, to make sure that foresight actually is relevant for policy making. Maybe I will leave it at those few comments.
Thank you very much, Franck. I would like maybe, so I see a few questions already in the Q&R, and I will turn to my colleague Marcel Muraille to help us on this and sort them out. But I was really struck by the interaction between our three panelists, and I'm very thankful to them, because while they haven't actually coordinated before joining us, they were quite well responding to each other. So maybe before turning to the audience, I would like to ask them whether they would like or would wish to comment on what they've heard from their fellow panelists. To agree, to disagree, or to complement. So I will do a second round, and starting with you, Mr. DEBIE. What do you think about what you've heard?
many things in my colleagues, and I really thank them for their intervention, are ringing bells that are aligned with the ESPAS adventure. As Peter said, it's very important not to reinvent the wheel. The ESPAS process was precisely launched to create a common base for foresight among the institution. And this initial design is very likely to be kept and extended. Knowledge about the future, knowledge about the trends, the catalyst, the things that accelerate, decelerate the risk hours to be shared among us in the Union. This is a common public good, and I think that what we are seeing now, and maybe thanks to English becoming a lingua franca among us, is the building of such a common base. Just to tell you about a mini adventure we had with ESPAS, we decided that, of course, everything we could produce would never be good enough to create such a knowledge base. So we decided to just offer a place where people, experts worldwide, having serious foresight work, could deposit their recent publication. And this is called Orbis. It's a digital repository available to the foresight community. And here, after 10 years of practice, we have almost 5,000 excellent pieces on different kinds of foresight, helping to understand the future, the policy option available at global level. The second, and it was very good to have Peter with us, maybe he could comment, is that many times when foresight is indicating that we are missing something, that as soon as the present, like Nicole was saying, we should start to act and maximize, optimize our capacity from the present to prepare the future. Many times in those cases where we identify something to be done, we don't have the institutions to do it, or we partly have the structure to do it. So if you want to have old structure designed for other purposes, addressing new issue, many times you are coming short. And to me, this is exactly what Vice President Šefčovič brought with the Battery Alliance. When he identified in the past that we would have a large problem to deliver climate change package, but also to keep industrial autonomy if we didn't master the technology of the battery of the future, including component, he created just a coalition between institution, business, member states to deliver research, financing, opportunities, regulation, legal basis. And very likely with foresight, it's not good enough to keep the institution. In some cases, we need to recreate coalition building, to push for foresight to impose the priority of the future on the political emergency of the present. There is no better solution than a present debate to bring foresight to democracy. And this is why the European Parliament is very likely one of the most advanced parliaments in integrating foresight in the public debate, the policy debate, the political debate. Members see an advantage of being exposed to foresight and bring back this to the constituency. And in some case, to use the result of foresight to push the leadership to be more active in certain direction. Foresight and democracy still have a long way to go together to make it more effective. And I really wish to thank colleagues to have brought that to the attention today.
Thank you very much. Sorry, do you hear me? Because I think that I did the wrong thing. Now, okay.
I hear you. Now we don't hear you anymore.
there we are. I'm sorry about this. So, I mean, back again to the Conference on the Future of Europe, and still with us. Nicole Dewand, what kind of reflection or maybe further puzzlement have you taken from the intervention of the two other panelists?
Well, I like very much the fact that Peter mentioned the need to build foresight capacity without duplicating what is taking place at member state level, and also the raw material exercise, which show how, and it feeds into the fact that foresight, I think, can bring, by making connection that we are not prone to make in the classical policymaking conversation. So I believe a lot of innovation taking place because of new connection. And this is missed when we think of holism, for example. We seem to look at things as if I were in a block, and we miss the fact that it's about resonation between different tracks where innovation can come from. So that, and this, I just, to bring maybe some disagreement, I don't know if it is a disagreement with Peter, when we say in a terms of fatalistic way, yes, policymakers are stuck in short term. I think it is important for us to question the fact that this short-termism, as I said, is when we say we are stuck in short term, that means that we consider that politics can only be about balancing conflicting interests. And we feel we've done our job when we have balanced conflicting interests in a fair way. I think it is not good enough. So neither is balancing conflicting interests good enough, neither is having a clear, sound-based scientific evidence determine political choice in a univocal manner. And foresight is a third, I would say, element that policymakers have to, if they were like a witch or druid making a pot, they have to mix together the balancing of interests, which will always remain there, the scientific evidence for what needs to be done, and the foresight, and taking into account that this should play out together and not jumping from one to the other in a schizophrenic way. So creating these new, and that will also improve resilience of the policymaking. So I would really plead that we all, from where we are, try to make this mind exercise to approach the other constituency or interlocutors, widening a little bit our worldviews, so that the interaction between all our positions gives a better result. So instead of accepting, for example, short-term, long-terms. So I really plead for enriching the policy foresight relationship, to accompany this with a reflexiveness of foresighters on their own activity and on policymakers on the way they do policymaking together with it.
Thank you, Nicole. This time I think that my audio is well connected and that we should hear me. So I'm now turning to Marcel, because there are a few questions already in the Q&A box. I have also one question in the chat, but I will come back on that later. So Marcel, please just feed our discussion with the questions from the audience.
Yes, many thanks, Jean-Louis. So a couple of questions from the audience. First question by Major David Mamnounta from the Royal Military Academy. He's asking, how do we involve decision makers who have a short-term horizon, while foresight looks mainly at longer-term problematic? I think it has been partially answered by Madame Dewandre when she emphasized on the coordination between the long-term and the short-term, but certainly good to hear all the speakers again on this issue, on how do we involve decision makers who might be limited by, let's say, a short or medium-term mandates in foresight exercise. And then two other questions, one from a person working for the Fondation Juste and another from Dimitri Verschuren. Both questions are related to who should we involve in foresight exercise. So the first question is on, do you consider that we should count more on the cultural sector to achieve effectively this new vision? And the other by Dimitri Verschuren on, is there a DG that meets the future planning of the EU together with all related industry? Meaning, how does the EU involve the EU industries in the EU? How do the institution involve EU industries in foresight exercise? Maybe we could start with Madame Dewandre.
unmuting. On the first, I think I said what I had to say, so I will leave it to the two other panelists. On the second, yes, of course, the cultural sector and all, we insist on foresight being participatory, and the exercise that are going will be undertaken by the Commission in the coming years will involve industry, but also artists and citizens and other stakeholders to do this participatory foresight. So this, just to keep it short, I don't know if I missed an aspect of the question, but I would leave it there.
Marcel, what comes next?
Maybe Monsieur Van Kemseker or Mr. DEBIE would like to react on these two couple of questions.
I think that the question, if I may stress it, it's about, okay, consultation, yes, but I mean, how can you remain neutral in consulting all the relevant bodies when you want to, I mean, perform, I mean, the best possible objective foresight about the future? What kind of stakeholders do you have to involve, and at what point do you have to disconnect from these stakeholders and make up your own mind about what you are going to communicate to policymakers? Over to you. Franck, Peter Van Kemseker maybe, and then Franck DEBIE.
Well, basically, what the interesting question here I find in this discussion is the short term and the long term, and then I come to the stakeholders that you discussed. I fully agree with what the previous speakers have said, but of course, a phenomenon that we very often see is that the CEO is under huge pressure from stakeholders, just like a politician is under pressure from his or her constituency. And this is a reality, I think, that sometimes prevents jumping on or really engaging in foresight. That's what I meant with the risk of a short term. And an even bigger risk, I think, is the risk of silos. For me, foresight is the antidote to silent thinking. I mean, the current transitions in which we are currently in, be it the green transition or the digital transition, they are all encompassing. You need a social dimension. You need the cultural sector. I'm very happy that somebody brought it up. And this brings me to the number of the stakeholders. It is crystal clear, I think, that this should be very broad, not only as an input for foresight, but the point I often miss is also, once you have more or less a picture of what the future can be or what are the opportunities and the threats, that we also engage more in communicating. And there sometimes it's better, I think, to communicate, to use so-called ambassadors to help you spreading that message. Opinion makers that are really embedded in society. And that's a completely different picture when we in our foresight community say how important it is what has to be done. And here again, the cultural sector plays an important role, I think, just like under other opinion makers who can reach out to groups that that for us are very difficult to target. So a very broad group, I think. And in the end, of course, decisions have to be made. But I just refer to the exchange I had last week in the network of EU policy planners. What was really interesting for me to see there is that we as member states, together with people from the External Action Service, we are not sitting there with strict instructions where capitals will tell us what to say and so on. It is basically an opportunity to feel the temperature. And this is something that can be done with and should be done, I think, with a very broad range of stakeholders, so that we more or less instinctively feel where we are going based on the models, based on different scenarios. And then in the end, and that's obvious as well, politicians will have to take the decisions, that's clear. But let us carve out some space also that allows us to take some space to have some brainstorming and to feel the temperature on where we are.
Mr. DEBIE.
Yes, I think I couldn't agree more with what Nicole and Peter had said. But on the cultural sector has been treated for a long time, and I speak of France, that is the member state I know the more, but maybe also at EU level, as a communication vehicle. So let's use cultural figures to better package what has been more or less prepared by the rational people. And this is completely wrong. It's not the tradition of our history. European nations have always considered that people writing theater, artists, had something genuine to say about the future, that by their own cultural activity, they are people exploring the potential of the future. We may have a translation problem of this activity and those intuitions gathered in the cultural sector into policy, but maybe not much more than people doing mega modeling. And I think that here we are sitting on a hidden treasury in many other countries where we have a large number of people in the creative sector that have not been challenged by the political institution to bring their perspective on the future of society, on the future of the planet, on the future of cooperation between individuals and the deeper sense of belonging, to the extent that among the risks we have identified in the EPRS study, one had to do with culture and the lack of common European identity and the difficulty for the political leadership to articulate an agenda in that field. But if you miss a certain level of common identity, it's extremely difficult then to discover solidarity in difficult period. So I really plead that the cultural sector is not taken only as a distribution vehicle of foresight and policy option, but as a genuine place of exploration of the future. For the private sector, it's a little bit the same. Of course, every successful company those days, and Belgium is full of them, is transitional if it wants to be successful. So all companies are successful ones are driven by a vision of the future. We may think that they are only driven by a vision of the future of their sector or only driven by the future of their technology. But many times when we try to explore a dialogue with them, not on their business, not on their sector, we discover that they have also a lot to say about the future of society, the future of work, the future of health, the future of aging. So let's not forget that we have a larger group of people much beyond the limit of traditional think tanking and academic foresight able to contribute. And we hope that the conference on the future of Europe will be an occasion to emancipate this energy after when we return maybe to more fluid kind of communications.
Thank you very much to our three panelists for these quite comprehensive answer to difficult question, not difficult to understand, but difficult on the substance because they really touch on the substance. We are now getting near to the end of this webinar. So Marcel, I will ask you maybe to take two last questions. Maybe the one which is in the chat box and the one which is which has just been put in the Q&A box now, and then we'll bring this webinar to a close. Marcel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. A question from Marie Cormand. What are the major obstacles impeding the taking of foresight studies into consideration in policy making? And another last question from Gert Timmerman. Is the aim of strategic foresight to converge possibly conflicting perspectives of stakeholders or to lead to a number of policy options from which politicians should choose?
May I, before giving the floor to our panelists, make one comment, abusing of my position of moderator? The question of Marie Cormand reminds me a debate I attended a few weeks ago about amongst think tankers concerning the ethics of the think tanks. Yes, we might also be ethical people sometimes in the think tanks. And someone during the debate said, after all, who is the most successful think tanker? It's the one who sings to the politicians the song that they want to hear. So could we transfer that sentence to the Foresighter and say that after all, the most successful Foresighter in his or her communication with policymakers is the one who brings them the message that they are implicitly or not expecting to get? I would leave you with this provocative thought, but who wants to chip in on these two questions? Maybe Nicole Dewald first, and then Peter van Gemselker and Franck DEBIE, the same order? Nicole Dewald?
Yeah, unmuting. On the question from from Mr. Timmerman, we have introduced in the report, Strategic Foresight report, the notion of dynamic coherence to say that foresight can also help to turn what is currently seen as a trade-off into a synergy, and that this also can change the game, be a game changer, to improve the pursuit of objective. Because when I heard earlier that we have ignored such or such dimension, we were thinking in silo. I think it was not so much in silo, then the form of integration was at the expense of one of the pillar to the benefit of the other. So sometimes what we have to now do is to ensure that where we had externalities, to turn them into internalities or make converging things that used to be not compatible before. So indeed, strategic foresight could be used, I think, to help foster a conversation between stakeholders who have currently conflicting perspectives and accompany their own adaptation so that they can see the challenge they have and the challenge of the other in a different way, and maybe align in the policy agenda. So indeed, strategic foresight could be used for each stakeholder to revisit maybe, and also admit that his pure interest, if it was really good enough to do policy making where everybody just fight for their own interest, a sort of invisible hand in policy making, so to speak, things would be much easier, and I think we wouldn't need foresight. We are not in this situation. I think we all admit that just balancing conflicting interests is not good enough and doesn't lead to the good decision. So this is why, but this is why we have to accommodate for balancing interest with a perspective. But that perspective cannot become a sort of, even if it is holistic, it will never be, it cannot be a straitjacket. I don't think that the present can be straitjacketed in the name of a common vision of the future. I don't think that can happen. But what we can surely do is by this discussion, disentangle where the sort of narrow interest-led political game drive us to the wall and where we need to change that. This I strongly believe. So that's for the question of Mr. Timmerman. For Marie Corman, it's not necessarily that there are major obstacles that it would be good enough to take them out and everything would be swift. The situation is such that lobbies are expressing their point of view. It's also the way we listen to them and how we can filter what are the arguments that need to take into account and the argument that could be pushed back. So the same with human inertia. It's a lot about also how we filter what we hear, and that we call for the people, of our interlocutors, to help us in succeeding in our mission. That is also important. I'm done.
But maybe just to add on that, on the obstacles, the problem with foresight is a bit the same problem as you have with conflict prevention. It's very hard to say sometimes that you have prevented a conflict because it doesn't really show. During the lockdown, I was reading Machiavelli again, The Prince. I can really recommend it again. And there is a passage on foresight. Machiavelli, at one point, he recommends, he tells the prince that when a problem is perceptible, when people, leaders, policymakers see that there is a problem, it's already too late to find a remedy and to find a cure. So it takes quite some leadership also and some convincing power to convince people that they actually have to act on something that is not visible yet. And this is sometimes not that easy, I think, because we live in a world that is always described as a VUCA world, very unpredictable, very volatile, very ambiguous, and so on. And you have to meander through all the signals that you get from lobbyists, but also from people in the think tanks. So I think what is sometimes missing is leadership, foresight and leadership. If you look at the history of policy making, going back to Confucius even, it always comes back to a combination of foresight in combination with leadership. Otherwise, it will not be effective. And secondly, I very much like the previous intervention on out-of-the-box thinking. It's not so evident. In the private sector, everybody's looking for the blue ocean strategy. And I think in politics, in international politics, we're all swimming around in an ocean that is clearly a red ocean. So we have to find those ideas that move us towards the blue ocean, definitely on restoring multilateralism. That's where we need out-of-the-box thinking. And that's why I like very much the input given by the previous speaker, who also said, let's not stick to our own bubble, but let's also look at stakeholders who have sometimes very original opinions, but can actually change our state of mind. So these are two things I think that I wanted to add, but I leave it at that.
Yes, to follow up after Confucius, it's difficult to elevate the debate further, but I think self-training is part of the answer. We need more people trained in foresight. We need foresight curricula. We need training at top university. We need postdoc in foresight. We need to train seriously literate people in science, social science, but also in other domains to be able to join as a future professional foresight community. There is a great danger with this growing need for foresight to see an inflation of Dr. Elixir. People just saying, I'm a foresighter, I have little imagination on the future, I have my crystal ball ready here. We need something different, and modernity in Europe and the modernity of our policy making very likely would be improved by serious training in the member states, in the region, in the university, to the varied methodology of foresight. And as Nicole was saying, re-investigating the different concepts we use for foresight. Past and present can mix. The silo structure of our policy making are maybe not relevant for some future issue. The future should not dictate over the present. Foresight is also about identification of things already happening and likely to help in the future. The last idea about ethics, we are all having a problem with the consulting ethic, saying to the boss what he wants to have. And here it's a training you have also to have at school, in the family, an ethic of intellectual honesty, which some case is not paying back, of course, in the different structure we're working with. This ethic should be shared by the political leaders, but also the leader in civil society. So there is no good foresight without training, and very likely there is no good foresight for the future without an ethic of intellectual modesty, humility, and honesty.
Jean-Louis, your microphone is... We cannot hear you, Jean-Louis.
Yes, I will be the victim of my microphone until the end. After 8 months of a Zoom, I'm still struggling with it. Now, what I wanted to say is that there are still questions in the question box, but we really wanted to stick within the 60 or so minutes limit. All the more than, after all, it's only the beginning of the conversation. The conversation will continue over the 2 days of the ESPAS conference. This was just an appetizer. There is obviously a lot there are a lot of topics where we actually do not disagree, but we have to, agree to a common vision and a common approach to actually implement the agenda which is now proposed by the Commission, involving a very large foresight communities at European level. I assume that many of the participants, many of those who are with us tonight, will still be with you, and the day after with you, tomorrow and the day after tomorrow with you, Mr. DEBIE and the other members of the ESPAS networks. It's a very rich program, and I will myself try to connect to as many sessions as possible. Indeed, as Egmont, we are of the view that we have to follow this very closely. We'll wait for the suggestions made by Mr. Šefčovič when presenting the report in September to materialize, and see how the Commission will propose to involve networks of think tanks in these huge foresight community that they are envisaging to support. And of course, we look also forward to hear more about this conference on the future of Europe, and in general, the role of what the think tank will play, and also maybe contributing to this contribution to forward-looking approach, promoting and nurturing a forward-looking approach in getting the outcome of the discussion, which is intended to be as large as possible, if I read and understand the position of the different institutions, which still have to agree, by the way, on the future profile of this conference of Europe, on the future of Europe. I'm sorry. So again, thank you very much to the three of you to have taken 1 hour out of your very busy schedule. Thank you to all the participants who have been with us tonight. Thanks to Marcel for having supported us and supported me in the running of this webinar. And also thank you very much to the communication and events team of Egmont. Again, this is only the beginning for Egmont, the beginning for the advertisement of the ESPAS conference, which means that our paths will certainly cross again in the future, hopefully in a less virtual way, with all due respect to the digital agenda, of course, but that might not be for tomorrow, but that might well be for the day after. Thanks a lot. Have a good evening and enjoy the conference for the next 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.